Now, the world of literature remembers Dr. Samuel Johnson as the compiler of the first English-language dictionary, a great intellectual and a leading essayist. Yet when Johnson died in 1784, his will surprised his contemporaries because he left the bulk of his estate to Francis Barber, the Jamaican-born slave who came to the writer's house when he was 10 and who faithfully served him for many years. Well, that relationship is explored in the book The Fortunes of Francis Barber, and I'm delighted to say that its author, Michael Bundock, now joins me in the studio. A very good morning to you.
Good morning.
And it was an extraordinary relationship because it was almost like a father and son thing, wasn't it?
There was definitely an element of that. It's fascinating because obviously when it starts off, Barber is quite young.
He was 10.
He's about 10 when he's brought to England, having been a slave in Jamaica, and becomes a servant in Johnson's household. But as he gets older, there's almost this sort of sense of role reversal as he becomes more, not so much the dominant figure, but he's almost looking after Johnson as Johnson gets old.
Because he was certainly with Johnson when Johnson was dying. And in fact, the book explores what actually happened on that night, because it's been very eulogised to a certain extent. It's actually quite brutal.
That's right. Johnson was very distressed, and he was very anxious. He feared death greatly. And it was a very disturbing night. But eventually he did settle down into a sense of calm, and he died, and Barber was actually at his bedside as he died.
Now, in terms of that relationship, Barber came there as a servant. But it was rather sort of odd way that he arrived in the Johnson household in the first place.
Well, he was brought to England by his owner, Colonel Bathurst, who'd been the plantation owner in Jamaica, who had a connection with Samuel Johnson via his son. And I think it was the son who suggested that Barber should join Johnson's household as a servant. And Johnson, we have to remember, was really very well known for being anti-slavery. So I think maybe there's a bit of a statement there as well.
And it was a very odd household, very eccentric, because you had all sorts of people who were living in different parts of the house. And even though Johnson himself didn't have much money, he was funding them. It's
a very eccentric household. We have a whole load of people, waifs and strays, essentially, whom Johnson took in because they were needy, and he was very charitable.
Yeah, because he was very paternalistic in that sense as well.
Very much so, yes. So there was a blind poetess, Anna Williams, and there was a frequently
She was
drunk...
the housekeeper.
She was the housekeeper. There was a sort of quack doctor who was drunk much of the time, Robert Levitt. So it was a very odd and mixed household.
And how did Barber cope with this? Because he never kept a diary or anything. So it must have been rather disconcerting for a youngster, a black youngster, living in this house of very strange people in 18th century Britain.
That's right. It must have been so bizarre, having come from slavery only a short time before. But we do know that he got fed up with the house after a while, after a few years, because he recalls much later on that he walked out essentially after some kind of dispute.
Because he joined the Navy as well.
He did. He served in the Navy during the 7 Years' War. And again, that was an interesting choice because he's beginning to show a bit of independence. He chose to do that. He volunteered. He wasn't press-ganged.
Which is what Johnson assumed he had been.
Johnson assumed he had been, but that wasn't so. It was Barber's choice. And it wasn't a bad choice. You could make a reasonably good living in the Navy.
Sure. And for a time he did. But the other interesting thing about Barber was that in his late 20s, he got married. His wife was younger than him, and she was white. So were interracial marriages very unusual in Regency London, given that you actually had not a sizable black population, but you still had a pretty reasonable sized one for the time?
That's right. They weren't unknown, but they weren't very common. And it's fascinating to see the reactions because they're very contrasting. Johnson is very supportive. And in fact, he takes Barber and his wife and eventually their whole family into his household. And this eccentric household gets even bigger. But some other people, and especially John Hawkins, who was a friend of Johnson and later his first major biographer, he was very hostile to the marriage and to Barber personally.
Sure. Now, the family had 4 children.
That's right.
They had 2 boys. The first child died, but both children, the child who died and the surviving boy, were given Samuel Barber's first name.
They were both
Samuel Johnson's first name.
They were both called Samuel, and that's clearly, a recognition of Samuel Johnson.
And how much money did Johnson actually leave to Barber? Because by today's standards, it's probably very small, but if you translate it into today's currency, it was very, very generous.
Well, the actual amounts were, he left an annuity of £70 a year, and he left a lump sum of about £1,500. When you compare that with his annual earnings in the Navy, which were £11, we're talking a huge sum of money here.
And he left London and went to Lichfield in Staffordshire. So again, the Johnson connection. And what became of him?
Well, he went to Lichfield, as you say, at Johnson's suggestion, and for a while he was quite a respected figure there. Interestingly, he was elected by the local people as a dozener, a sort of local jury member. But sadly, he worked through the money very quickly and became quite poor. But at one point, very interesting, he set up a school, a small school, and it's quite possible he was the first black schoolmaster in Britain.
Sure. And the other fascinating thing as well, because time is very tight, is that his descendants are alive to this day, and they're white, the other twist in the story.
That's right.
Michael Bundock, we have to leave it there. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me here on This Day Live.